Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 102, The Mediterranean Simmers. Last time, we introduced Seleucus IV, our seventh and new Seleucid ruler. We caught him up to 187 BCE, the year he became sole king. Let's see how he gets on as he starts his rule proper, specifically by examining the world around him at about this time. We'll see the Mediterranean is bubbling with anti-Roman resentment, and also with factional tension between pro- and anti-Roman sentiment. Along the way, we will catch up with Macedon and watch a failed coup attempt by the king against the heir. Not the usual way around, I know. Edwin Bevan kicks off our discussion of Seleucus IV by saying that he has been criticised for not being the most ambitious of Seleucid monarchs. However, Bevan says that this was actually prudent. To be proactive at the moment Seleucus IV became king, quote, would have been madness, end quote. Rome was now a rising power in the Mediterranean, and although it did not actually own any land east of the Adriatic Sea at the time, its dominance was being felt by the whole eastern Mediterranean. What the Greek world wanted was to get out from under Rome's shadow before they could no longer do so. However, there were states allied to Rome, meaning there was not a united sense of what to do. And so, anyone spearheading an anti-Roman effort, as Antiochus III had done, would not have met with unanimous support. That said, there were those who wanted to do something. Philip V of Macedon had been smarting ever since the war against Antiochus III. He felt he'd not been rewarded enough following the Seleucids' downfall. So, he began to plot. However, he died in 179 BCE, meaning his plans came to nothing. Now, I know this is looking forward a little bit, and I'll come back to why exactly this is relevant in a moment, but we should talk about his succession. The next king of Macedon was his son, named Perseus. However, the story is more complicated than this single line would suggest. The Roman historian Livy tells us that Philip V died due to old age and, quote, broken by grief after the death of his son, end quote. Now, this seems a really random line. For one thing, which son? We've only introduced Perseus. So, let's rewind a little bit. The son Livy is referring to is called Prince Demetrius. And so yes, in case you were worried by the name Prince Perseus and how unique it was, we do have a Demetrius to reassure us that the Hellenistic world is still as unoriginal as ever. Demetrius was born in about 207 BCE. He had previously been sent as a hostage to Rome during the war against Antiochus III, specifically in 197 BCE, being sent back to Macedon in 191. Now, Demetrius was the younger son of Philip V, with Perseus being his older brother, born 5 years earlier in about 212. Edwin Bevan does, however, say Perseus was illegitimate. Not that sources such as Wikipedia or Livy himself seem to think that this affected anything. That said, Demetrius was popular with the people, and as of 182 BCE, that popularity had been rising. Demetrius was also influential with the Romans, which in his age is never a bad thing. So Perseus began to feel worried for the security of his inheriting the throne. So he began to imagine he would need to use criminal actions to get hold of Macedon, and began whispering among Philip's friends. At first, they were more inclined to back Demetrius, but as Perseus showed himself to be increasingly anti-Roman over time, Demetrius did not. So, the idea began to spread that Perseus' takeover was inevitable, and thus the nobles should swap to the winning side. Mocking Romans, and thus smearing Demetrius by association, also became popular. This strategy worked. Demetrius defended the Romans time after time, and so Philip began sidelining his second son in favour of Perseus. I won't go into details in this next bit, but Perseus and Demetrius eventually argued. Demetrius got drunk one night and wanted to smooth things over, so he and a bunch of attendants went to Perseus's house. However, there's a relevant detail that needs to be covered. One of Perseus's spies had previously been caught and beaten up by the attendants of Demetrius. The young men with Demetrius were worried about revenge coming their way, so hid weapons on them. Predictably, someone ran ahead to Perseus's dwelling place and told him that armed men were coming to his house along with his brother Demetrius. You can see how this looks without the proper context being added. Actually, scratch that, you can just see how this looks, full stop. The door was, perhaps understandably, barred, and Demetrius, after yelling outside the house drunkenly to be let in, headed back, and Livy says, quote, in ignorance of the full significance of the incident, end quote. The next day, Perseus went to the palace at the first opportunity and accused his brother of attempting to kill him. Philip V therefore had to sit in judgment. Perseus accused his brother of wanting the throne and of attempting to come at him with an armed mob. Demetrius was in tears and did not speak for a while after the accusation. When he did, he in turn accused Perseus of distorting events. He denied wanting to kill Perseus with the aim of being granted the throne instead. Perseus had also alleged that Demetrius had conspired with the Romans to put himself on the throne. The prince flatly denied it and stated that Philip V should have had him killed long ago as a traitor if that were the case. He did not deny that he'd been drunk, and in fact used this to his advantage, arguing it would have made more sense for him to be sober on the night he supposedly wanted to kill his brother, instead of carousing as was apparently his custom. He turned the tables on Perseus and attacked his brother's jealousy, knowing that what Perseus really wondered was why there was even a discussion to begin with about Demetrius being a possible successor to Philip V. In the end, the attempted murder charge was laughed away, but the dark mark of suspicion had still fallen on Demetrius because of his popularity with Rome. So, Demetrius accordingly tried to cut ties after the trial and didn't even mention them. Still, when Philip V next went out with his army, he took Perseus with him and left Demetrius at home, something the latter definitely noticed. Now, you might expect Perseus isn't just going to leave it at this, and in time, Demetrius was accused again, and this time there were forged letters from Romans to back the idea of his plot up. This time, it couldn't be ignored, and in fact, the decision was made to do something about Demetrius. Livy tells us in Book 40 of his histories that it was resolved Demetrius would not be punished publicly. Instead, he would be poisoned secretly at a dinner hosted by Philip V in 181 BCE. And, well, he was. So, that's Perseus's opposition gone. Incidentally, I know this is a very rough outline, and we haven't really dealt that much with Perseus, Demetrius, or Philip V before now, but since this is not the History of Macedon podcast, I thought it was best not to get too bogged down. Anyway, Philip V died the following year, and this is something we need to expand on a bit. He had been distressed at the fact that his son Perseus was essentially acting as if he already was king while his father was still alive. At this juncture, we need to introduce another member of the House of Macedon to our story. This is Antigonus, son of Echecrates. Antigonus was also a nephew of Antigonus III, who we introduced upon the death of Antigonus II. Our younger Antigonus, son of Echecrates, had stayed loyal to Philip V and not been swayed by Perseus. So he was concerned for his life should Perseus end up becoming king. Antigonus also knew that Philip V was not fully behind his son and was mourning for the death of Demetrius. So, Antigonus began to work against Perseus to try and expose his plots against his late brother. Perseus's machinations were eventually exposed to Philip while he was still alive. Philip V then resolved to take away the reward Perseus had done all this for: the throne. So, he conferred the kingship to Antigonus. He even remarked he would rather have let Macedon end altogether rather than hand it to Perseus, had there not been a worthy successor. At this time, Perseus was in Thrace. So, Philip V recommended Antigonus to the nobles, and it was looking like Antigonus would become the next king. However, at this critical juncture, Philip then fell ill and died. Not all was lost. Antigonus could still have become king, except he was not physically present when Philip died, and the news was not made public. Instead, a doctor called Caliganes, who attended to Philip, sent word to Perseus, who promptly seized power. In case you were wondering, Antigonus was put to death. So, rest in peace, the arguable king Antigonus IV. You might be wondering, how does any of this relate to our story moving forward? Well, because Perseus will pick up right where Philip V left off in terms of plotting against Rome. So, as I keep saying, I know all of this is still some ways in the future from where we are in 187, but it shows us that not everything smells of roses when it comes to how the Eastern Mediterranean feels about Rome. Over in Anatolia, meanwhile, Eumenes II tried to strike up a friendship with the Seleucids, which I believe he may have done while Antiochus III was still alive after Magnesia. Now that the Seleucids were weaker, Eumenes wanted to get out of the sudden isolation he'd found himself in, as the only conspicuous friend of Rome among the Asian kings. So he began to rub shoulders with the Seleucids. Now, Pergamon wasn't the only power that was changing. Over in Cappadocia, Mithridates II, the father of Laodicea III and thus grandfather now of Seleucus IV, died after a rule of about 60 years. He was succeeded by his son Pharnaces. This son now began conquering territory along the north coast. Eumenes II and Bithynia, among other states who were allies of the Romans, now began eyeing up Cappadocia suspiciously. Edwin Bevan notes in this section of Volume 2 of the House of Seleucus that Cappadocia had the potential to also become the centre of an alliance opposed to Rome. As you can see, Anatolia, and indeed the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly, is bubbling. Seleucus IV, trapped on the other side of the Taurus Mountains, watched all of this unfold. Now, he might not have been allowed to get involved in Western affairs anymore after the Treaty of Apamea, but there was still some subtle movement. He renewed a friendship with the Achaean League and tried to offer them 10 warships in 187-186, but the latter was rejected. Bevan supposes there may have been more of this sort of soft power interactions, but a lack of records hides them. A war, lasting from 183 to 179, did eventually break out between Pharnaces of Cappadocia and the anti-Cappadocian bloc who'd been eyeing him up. Why is this relevant to us? Well, it seems as if Seleucus IV was poised to get involved, on the side opposed to the Romans. In fact, he took an army all the way west to the Taurus Mountains. That said, before he could cross over into Anatolia and break the terms of the Treaty of Apamea, his nerves failed him. He ultimately did not cross over, and instead left Pharnaces to his fate, which was to be defeated by the pro-Roman coalition. The simultaneous arrival of anti-Seleucid war veteran Titus Flaminius to the court of Seleucus IV may have done something to dissuade him from invading the prohibited lands. Anyway, we now get to a wedding. This is the marriage between Perseus, the rabid anti-Roman villain of our story so far, and Laodike, the daughter of Seleucus IV. We speculated last time that she had been born in 183 BCE, making her about 24 years younger than her husband. The marriage took place in 178 BCE, which, if I've done my estimates correctly, makes Laodike about 5 years old at the time, and Perseus about 29. This does cast some doubt on the date we inferred for her birth date, given the massive age disparity here, so it's possible this was just a betrothal rather than a marriage at this stage, or else my calculations from last episode are just wrong. What we do know is that, before Laodike's death in 150 BCE, she would bear Perseus 4 children and have 2 or 3 children by another husband we won't discuss right now. However, we will get to it down the line. The children by Perseus are listed as Alexander, Philip, Andriscus, although this one is a bit in doubt, and an unnamed daughter. Finally, let's set something up for the future. Since 189 BCE and the Treaty of Apamea, Seleucus' younger brother Mithridates had been a hostage in Rome. Well, sometime before 175, he was swapped for Demetrius, the eldest son of Seleucus IV. Incidentally, Bevan actually confirms that he was named for Demetrius I, the Antigonid father of the original Stratonike. The name was either intended as a friendly gesture to the Seleucids' Macedonian cousins at a time when they were collectively besieged by Rome, or else as a reminder that the Seleucids were the inheritors by blood should the only Macedonian left at the time, Perseus, die without heirs. That said, we know he ends up with heirs, so I guess the gesture would have been a bit of a moot point if that was the case. Either way, Prince Demetrius was carted off to Rome. That's where we will leave off for today. Next time, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the new administration. However, until then, thank you all for listening as always. If you have a question or a comment, feel free to get in touch at the show's email address, which as a reminder is afteralexpod@gmail.com. Until next time, have a great week everyone.